All right, so welcome everyone. We've got quite a few people joining us already this morning. This is the YP2LE Learning Network webinar entitled Making International Programming More Inclusive and Accessible. We're happy to have everyone joining us today. As people join us online here on Zoom and through YouTube, I'm just going to go through some introductions to get us started. Again, this is the YP2LE Learning Network webinar entitled Making International Programming More Inclusive and Accessible. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with registrants post-event. The event is also being shared live on our YP2LE YouTube page. So my name is Cole Simcoe. I use he, him pronouns. I have medium length brown hair, which is pulled up this morning. I'm wearing glasses and a black button-up shirt. I'm joining today from my empty office here in Washington, DC. I am a senior associate of communications at Making Sense International, and here to support the YP2LE team with our events and convenings. Before we begin, I'm just going to go through a few platform and accessibility features included in today's webinar. We are joined today by two ASL sign language interpreters, Laura and Daniel. So welcome them both. You'll see them on your screen. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to one of my colleagues, longtime colleagues, Maria Brindelmeyer, Senior Knowledge Management Specialist for YP2LE. So Maria, welcome and good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Welcome to this latest webinar in our Learning Network webinar series. I am using she, her as my pronouns. I have brown hair and I'm wearing glasses. And I'm wearing a green shirt and scarf today. I'm joining you today from my home office. So for those of you who haven't joined some of our webinars before, just a very brief introduction to YouthPower 2 Learning and Evaluation and Positive Youth Development. So YouthPower 2 Learning and Evaluation, or in short YP2LE, is a USAID funded activity that is based on a positive youth development approach. And positive youth development, or again an abbreviation PYD, is a development approach which recognizes and supports youth rights to assets, such as skills and financial assets. It also supports the ability of youth to leverage those assets through agency and supports their ability to contribute to positive change for themselves and their community. And last but certainly not least, positive youth development states that youth should be surrounded by an enabling environment. And today's webinar is particularly focused on that enabling environment so that we actually have an inclusive youth program when we are implementing activities for youth. And our activities are focused on combining positive youth development evidence building, stakeholder engagement, knowledge transfer, and then the application of that learning to over time achieve systems change. And our program activities include the learning network as a key component of our programming activities, and that includes communities of practice. We have several communities of practice which we encourage you to join on youthpower.org, and if you are a young change maker, we also encourage you to join us on youthlead.org. Today's webinar is a part of this Learning Network webinar series, and we believe that today's webinar is super important for successful youth programming, and we are so excited to have the speakers that you will hear from later today. And so with this, I'm handing it over back to Cole. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you for that background. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce Katherine Guernsey. Katherine is the Agency Disability Rights Coordinator for USAID. Kathy's going to kick us off this morning and give us a brief background as to why we're all here today and introduce some of our other speakers. So Kathy, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Kathy Guernsey. I'm the Agency Disability Rights Coordinator at USAID. My gender pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a middle-aged white woman with now short, curly brown hair. I had a haircut on the weekend and they took about 10 inches off, and I'm not used to saying that I have short hair. I'm wearing a dark blue blouse with some white flowers on, and I'm sitting here in my living room in front of my dining room table. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I was going to say this morning, but this afternoon and evening, depending upon where you're joining from. I know that everybody is here because you're really passionate about youth programming and you're really excited about supporting youth as our emerging leaders and frankly, our present leaders, right? And I know that you're here because you're interested in ensuring that the programming is as inclusive of everyone as possible. And I think we all recognize that there's more that we can be doing to make sure that our programming is inclusive of youth with disabilities in particular. Today, we're going to be having some lightning talks, which we'll introduce in just a moment. We'll be getting into a deeper dive discussion with our discussants. We'll have plenty of opportunity for discussion with you all in our chat box and with an interactive Q&A. And I hope today that what we can do is showcase a few examples, just a few, of how partners are looking to be inclusive of youth with disabilities in the design and implementation of their programming, to engage you in some conversation about what your experiences are. This is a sort of emerging community of practice that we want to foster here. And all being well, hopefully, we're creating as inclusive a virtual environment as we can in today's space. And again, if there's anything that's not working, please chat us or use the Q&A function to make sure that we're aware that if you're having any issues. And as I think was mentioned in the registration information, this will all work much better if you're using the Zoom software rather than just a web link. So I want to briefly introduce our presenters today. Joining us, we'll have 3 discussants from all over the world to share some brief presentations on how they have designed, implemented, and worked with youth with disabilities and their representative organizations to promote disability inclusive youth programming. We're going to be hearing from Nichelle Stefan, former intern in the Inclusive Development for the Uganda Youth Leadership for Agriculture program from Chemonix International. We'll be hearing from Juan Manuel Sanchez, former acting deputy chief of party of technical vocational education and training, strengthening for at-risk youth in Nicaragua, or TVETSE, Creative Associates. And we'll also be hearing from Milani Rotinsulu, chair of the Indonesian Association of Women with Disabilities. We've asked our panelists today to speak to one or more of the following questions. How have they designed an accessible youth implementation activity? What were some of the key components to think about early on, for example, around recruiting, announcements, structure of co-creation groups? How that activity has worked with people with disabilities and their organizations to make the programming more inclusive of youth with disabilities? And what have you done to implement those activities, including key factors you had to think about, from program tools and reports in accessible formats to transportation to and from training centers, making sure you have accessible physical and virtual spaces and so forth. So I'm really looking forward to what our presenters have to share. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Cole.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So with that introduction, I'd like to start off today We will begin by hearing from Nichelle, who was unable to join us today, but has pre-recorded her presentation for us. Nichelle has over 10 years experience working with people with disabilities. Nichelle received her master's in international development in May of 2020 in deaf studies from Gallaudet University. She completed her practicum experience with the Humanity and Inclusion Development Unit and has conducted preliminary research on addressing significant gaps in accessing and services for deafblind communities. Most recently, she supported the coordination of activities at a deaf school in Uganda while completing her internship with Chemonics International on their USAID Feed the Future Uganda Youth Leadership for Agriculture activity. Nichelle aims to continue to work with the deaf and deafblind community with technical skills related to inclusive education, participatory research, social justice, advocacy, and disaster risk reduction. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and show the video from Nichelle. Nichelle has, like I said, pre-recorded her video. It is in ASL and voiced over, so we'll go ahead and share that now. Give me 1 second to switch over while we do that. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nichelle Steffen. I'm coming to you from the Maryland, DC, Virginia area. I am a white, hearing, sighted, cisgender woman, and I'm wearing a black top and sitting up against a white wall with natural light streaming through my window to the left. I'm using American Sign Language, and the voice you're currently hearing is also my own. I completed an internship with Chemonics International just last spring in their Inclusive Development for Uganda YLA program. The internship was one final portion of my dual master's degree for International Development and Deaf Studies at Gallaudet University. Gallaudet is the world's only ASL English bilingual university, a campus where everything is entirely accessible in visual sign language. It is a cultural epicenter for the deaf community, a location of cultural transmission and exchange. This internship was the first of its kind, an innovative collaboration between Chemonics and Gallaudet. While Chemonics can offer students the chance to work in international development, Gallaudet students can share their insights from their unique cultural perspective. Deaf students in particular have expertise in their own lived experience. During my internship, I worked at a deaf school in rural Uganda, a new YLA grantee and community partner organization. In their 5th and final year of implementation, YLA strengthened their programming by capitalizing on inclusion with existing partners and expanding its reach to disability-specific organizations, such as this school. I provided support through the implementation process, including guidance on report writing and conducting computer literacy training to community members in Ugandan Sign Language. Then, in mid-March, with the rapid developments of the pandemic, we pivoted. I returned home at a moment's notice and instead connected with the Gender Equity and Social Inclusion team. With their support, Deo, a deaf YLA intern from Uganda, and I developed a one-pager on inclusive practices for collaborating with deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Then, to conclude my internship experience, we hosted a virtual brown bag event. It was an activity not planned prior to the pandemic, but which reached a much broader audience as a virtual event. Inclusive practices are not something I have mastered in any sense. Inclusion is something that we strive for and work towards. What I can speak to is my own experience, my own identities, and my youth experience. To me, it seems inclusion is not about checking a box, but rather it's about growing, expanding, and stretching the work. The concept of inclusion is visually represented in ASL like this, a bringing into. But isn't this a common misconception about inclusion, that there's a boundary of including? Isn't inclusion more of an opening, an engagement, extending a hand? Within my internship experience, for example, my role was already written when I came into the work. So I often sidelined myself to that particular role. And despite the fact that people did reach out and ask what I could offer, I didn't really have that opportunity until COVID upended everything. And I found a new room, a new space to offer myself and for collaboration. In my work, I have found inclusion to be doing something differently, doing something not done before. It's about opening historic boundaries which marginalized people and reaching out to those spaces, to those people. It's uncharted territory for those who are currently included, and those marginalized are the most equipped to navigate that space. They are the experts in their own lived experience. So inclusion is not for those people marginalized, it's for everyone. For example, consider how I opened this video. I said, I'm using ASL and this is my voice on the voiceover. This description might inform a person who is blind that I'm using sign language, but it's also informative for those people who don't know sign language, and now you know which of the world's sign languages I'm using, American Sign Language. In 2018, the World Federation of the Deaf-Blind conducted the world's first global report on individuals with deaf blindness. In their findings, they showed a significant risk that efforts to implement the CRPD and inclusive SDGs will exclude people with deaf blindness. What if we were to design programs for deafblind individuals at the outset? How might programs like this be inclusive for deaf people, for people with low vision, for people with intellectual disabilities, for those who temporarily don't have disabilities? Something to consider. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Michelle for taking the time to record that video for us today. We will also be joined by Shauna Karia, the global, who is from the Global Gender Equality, Female Empowerment, and Social Inclusion Practice Lead at Chemonics. I wanted to go ahead and invite Shauna to introduce herself here now.
Thank you so much, Cole. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to share Michelle's experience. Hello, everyone. As Cole mentioned, my name is Shauna Karia, and my gender pronouns are she, her, coming to you from my home in the Virginia, DC area. I am a hearing sighted cisgender woman with short brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. And I'm the global practice lead of the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Practice at Chemonics International. And I just want to say it is a pleasure to be here today, participating in this dialogue on youth and disability inclusion. I am honored to have worked with Michelle during her internship with the Uganda Youth Leadership for Agriculture activity with Chemonics International when she was completing her graduate degree at Gallaudet University. And as she mentioned in her video, when the pandemic hit and she returned from Uganda, together we were able to think creatively about how to conclude her internship differently. We collaborated to develop useful guidance on how to engage and work with deaf and hard of hearing communities in our development work, which we're happy to share with you all. It was definitely an unexpected turn of events, but she was able to share lessons learned in a guidance brief and a virtual event that is now widely accessible to our global audience. So I am so grateful that Michelle was able to share her experience today and lessons learned. And unfortunately, she cannot join us for the webinar. So it is really my pleasure to participate in the discussion following the Spark Talks to share my learning as well on youth and disability inclusion in our global programming. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shauna. Next, I'd like to invite our next lightning talk presenter, Juan Manuel Sanchez. He's the former acting deputy chief of party of TVET-SE Nicaragua. So welcome, Juan, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, thank you, Cole, um, for this opportunity. Hi, my name is Juan Manuel Sanchez. My gender pronoun is he, him. Today, I'm from my office at home, and I have a black short hair, and I'm wearing a purple shirt and a brown winter season sweater because it's cold this morning here in Guatemala, where I'm based currently. I am the former acting chief of body of the Technical Vocational Education and Training and Strengthening for At-Risk Youth Project, in short, TVETSE, implemented by Creative Associate International. And in September 2019, we received additional funding from the USAID Disability Fund to increase our reach to youth with disability and support them to increase their independent living and skills and inclusion into the community through workforce and life skills development and labor inclusion. TVETSE apply a systems approach, considering that the main barriers for young people with disability to be more independent and to be included in the community are found outside of them, in families, in companies, in community services. In Nicaragua, according to official data from 2016, the latest, only 44% of the children with disability have reached preschool or primary school levels, and less than 4% has access technical or university degree. According to another last inclusive labor study in 2011, 64% of the economically active age population with disability is outside the labor market. So it was a huge challenge for us in Nicaragua. Value creation is only possible when there's a close connection and understanding of the needs, expectations, and desires of the potential beneficiaries. In this sense, at the time of designing the activity, Creative Associates identified those organizations of people with disability that together represent a little more than 80% of the people with disabilities in Nicaragua, the Federation of People with Disabilities, and Los Pipitos Foundation. This allowed this organization to share with us their successes and failures, and together we identify those non-obvious needs that really require innovative attention. Once implemented, the first thing TVETSE did was determine what barriers youth with disability face in terms of labor inclusion. And we realized that one of the main barriers was the lack of knowledge that companies or people in general have about how to behave or to proceed when a young person with disability arrives at the recruitment processes or to a business or to a school or to any other social event. For this reason, TVETSE increased knowledge about disability national laws, and especially best practices on how companies can make reasonable accommodations to open doors to young people with disability. For the TVETSE team, it was also a challenge. Quickly, with the support of the staff of the Organization of People with Disability, our staff learned basic requirements to communicate and relate, for example, with the visually impaired people, or to establish a close collaboration with the National Association of Deaf People to ensure a smooth connection and communication with the hearing impaired beneficiaries. Our implementation approach was eminently based on the journey to self-reliance. Grants were given to the organizations of people with disability so that they could lead the implementation of the activities themselves, and our team provided the necessary support and accompaniment. With the pandemic, people with disabilities became one of the most vulnerable groups. So in compliance with USAID regulations, we supported this organization with protection material, and also in conjunction with Channel 14, Voz TV, a private TV channel in Nicaragua, we implemented an awareness campaign exclusively for people with disabilities on COVID-19 and protective measures. All training activities were adapted. What would have been face-to-face training became distance learning, making use of audible lessons for the visually impaired and cognitively impaired youth, or reading material for the hearing impaired. These materials were distributed either by WhatsApp, in the case of those who had access to smart device on the internet, or through a home delivery services, which involved delivering the material on a USB or a CD. To receive the assignments, participants could send recorded audio via WhatsApp or documents or by a phone call, the facilitator could receive the answer from visually impaired people who did not have access to the internet. The training was essentially practical, so each participant had to replicate their knowledge with other young people with disability, thus creating a peer-to-peer support mechanism that we call it communitarian youth employability counselors. At the community level, we also carry out an accessibility mapping with the help of the mobile application Ciudad Fácil, Easy City in English, which was created by a Chilean disabled people organization. And we learned our cities are far from being accessible, especially for people with hearing disability, for which we promoted several actions to increase accessibility level. For example, we launched a teleeducational program on sign language with this Voz TV, a private TV channel that reached more than 120,000 community members, and also trained 35 bank officers in sign language to facilitate access to banking services for people with hearing impairment. We were also able to promote with the companies an apprenticeship program for young people with disability, the first of its kind in Nicaragua, which fostered youth access to employment. TVET's support to disabled youth was about opening doors. TVET positively impacted the lives of more than 350 young people with disability, 51% being women, and all thanks to alliances with the private sector, TVET Center, and disabled people organization. From our work with Los Pipitos Foundation, a partner that I mentioned before, we learned that it's key to work with the family in order to create an environment at home that favors the strengthening of the independent living skill that the young people learn in the different training programs. The overprotection of parents or relatives is a challenge for the young people themselves. Therefore, multidisciplinary support groups were created to visit the homes and teach or support the families to relate healthily and positively with the young people. It was interesting to learn that in many families of hearing impaired youth, knowledge of sign language was often absent. A total of 45 families were taught basic sign language, improving thus the connection and the development of healthy relationship with the youth. From our work with the Federation of People with Disability, we learned that for advocacy work to be fruitful, it is necessary for this organization of people with disability to move out of the traditional areas of action. 13 members of organization of the Federation were integrated into the Nicaraguan Network for Technical Education. From they were able to evangelize to more than 150 companies, organizations about disability. We were also able to increase the Federation capacity to connect with the private sector and initiate collaborative relationships to facilitate a better understanding of what measures can be promoted for labor inclusion. And finally, 23 of the Federation member organizations were able to mainstream the gender approach in their norms, procedure, work plans, and projects. This is important considering, as I have already mentioned, that at national level, 52% of the population with disabilities are women. I will stop here and we'll have probably more space during the rest of the webinar to talk about other challenges and innovations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan Manuel. We're so happy to have you with us very early this morning, I should say, for you. Next, we're going to go ahead and hear from Melania Rotisulu. She's the chair for the Indonesian Association of Women with Disabilities. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and welcome Melania to the event.
Okay, thank you, Cole. Good morning, everybody, and good evening from Indonesia as well. So I'm Maulani Rotinsulu, the chair of Indonesian Association of Women with Disabilities. So today I used a pink blouse, and usually I use glasses, and today, but I just put it my glass first because I can see clearly as well with the in the screen of the Zoom, and my background. In my background, I use the organization logos. So the logo is the lotus flower, and it was written that HWDI. HWDI is stands for Indonesian Association of Women with Disabilities. So allow me to talk about the accessibility in business entrepreneurships, starting from giving information on the brief information about the projects. So the project is the third phase of the USAID concepts on independent entrepreneurs for the poor. So coming to the person with disabilities projects, this is the third. I mean, the first is talking about the youth, or the beneficiary of the project is the youth, and the second is for the women. So for person with disability is coming for the third phase of the JAPRI. Again, I should say JAPRI stands for the independent entrepreneurs. So the target beneficiary for person with disability supported by the Office of Economic and Employment Empowerment, or EEE of USAID. So how the project perform best in working with disabilities? I have 3 points here. First is this project working with disability rights community, or the organization of person with disabilities. Usually we use the stands for of the OPD. So OPD is to make sure that the meaningful participation of person with disabilities. We have involved them starting from the designing the plan, running the activities, as well as monitoring and evaluating the result of the projects. Second is the preparation of the project by preparing the concepts, mechanism, and the people to make them accessible to all. Make the project context inclusively and accommodated to the disability perspective, including the availability of accessibility and reasonable accommodation during the project implementation. So the process is starting from the assessment also on reasonable accommodation of the candidate of the participants. So when the USAID agency or partners, the Institute of International Education, came to us to make an approach on these projects, we start to talk about what is your planning on accessibility and reasonable accommodation for your project. So so the projects or the design, the module, the manual books are adopted. We revise all the manual books to be accessible to all. The third is inclusive policy and the standard of operational procedure design, including involving person with disabilities as implementer of the project. So mostly all the officers and also the participants, 74% of them are person with disabilities. So from the trainers, we train the trainers, mostly they are from person with disabilities. Also, we train the coaches as well. Most of them are person with disabilities. So the participants, the business motivation workshop, business model canvassing trainers, all of them coming from person with disabilities. Of course, we train them first to be the expert on this on this knowledge. So therefore, the preparation of this project is, longer enough because we would like to show that the person with disabilities are able to to be the implementer as well. So what was the accessibility in this project? So first is JAPRI concepts. Adopts the inclusive training facilitation simple language version to be used by all trainers and coaches, developed and adapted the manual books, such as like what I said before, to be more inclusive and easily to understand. Second is the module. The module should be in any accessible formats. I think everybody has already know that, like a printed materials, braille, word, soft copy, large prints, mostly the practice pages we print in a large prints. So and then the third is the trainers, the coaches, field officers, partners, local governments. All of them were trained by disability perspective and interaction training. So this DPIT stands for Disability Perspective and Interaction Training. All the trainers are also created at the time we designed the preparation of the projects. The fourth is providing accessibility in every activities and use accessible equipments such as accessible venue, transportations, such as lower decks cars, anything about how we make it easier to all person with disabilities involvement. One things that I would like to give some notes is about the more important things. One important things when we sit together in planning with a person with disabilities, all accommodation are not overlaps each other, and the policies are not discriminated each other. For instance, by providing announcement board or presentation board, which one that you would use, upper side or lower side of the board to be accessible for all. So lower side reachable by the wheelchair user. However, sometimes it was not too convenient with the standing people who needs more time to read, for instance. So how do you serve them all? Yes, we can provide seat whenever they need. So accessibility is not only for person with disabilities. When we have to choose, we choose the effective ones. So this is kind of when we talk about the reasonable accommodation or accessibilities, we found out in the preparation stage of the projects. So we write it together with the person with disabilities itself in every level or in every occasion of the activities that we will, we plan. Something like this is, for me, it's very easy when we try to give understanding to the person without disabilities relating to the accessibility and even the reasonable accommodation, because reasonable accommodation is really based on who you are interact with, such as like what type of person with disability, and we can just assess immediately to them to ask what they need, which one is they convenient to, and then we write it. Something like that. It's easy for Women with Disabilities Association to make everybody understand and feel. I think it's they see that the accessibility is not something so so to be afraid of, and then people with disability is able to be the implementer as well. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Melania. And thank you to all of our speakers for those lightning talks. What I'd like to do now is move into the next section of our webinar, which is really a deep dive into some of the discussions that we were having and some of the points that our speakers have brought up. So I'd like to ask everyone joining us today to reflect on some of the experiences shared by our presenters and some of your own experiences as we kind of look into some challenges, successes, and ways in which we've had to pivot to become more inclusive in our programming and work. So I'm gonna go ahead and share the questions that we will be discussing with the panelists in the chat, or Alex will go ahead and do that for us. And I'm encouraging everyone to answer these questions through the chat and have an open and honest discussion about what your experiences have been. I will go ahead and read the questions for you as well. The first question is, what have you found most challenging when you tried to make your activities accessible, and what solutions have you found to be the most successful? The second is talking about success stories. What success stories have you achieved in your programming that you would like to share? And then the third question is a timely question. Considering the global pandemic has forced us all to adapt operations and approaches, what lessons or insights can you share about how this has affected inclusionary practices across your work? With that, I will ask our presenters and Kathy to come back online and welcome you guys to the discussion.
So I think you alluded to some of this in your presentations as well. But, are there specific challenges that maybe you didn't anticipate having that maybe were a surprise to you, or some things that maybe knowing what you know now, if you could go back in time and warn yourself, hey, you need to pay attention to this specific issue. Here's a solution that was helpful. Maybe it's not the only solution, but it's something that worked for you. Do you have any of those kinds of experiences you'd like to share? Maybe Juan Manuel, would you like to start us off there?
Yeah, thank you. And because I'm the only man in the panel, so so yeah, I think that one thing that it was a real challenge for us in Nicaragua was the lack of information. Because when we were trying to design the activity, trying to understand what the needs, the numbers, and the trends and the expectations, we only rely on reports and study like was 10 years ago, and 10 years the things have changed so many. So what we did, as I mentioned in my presentation, is that we go directly to the DPOs, to the organization with the of people with disability, because they know the sector, they know the needs, they know what they want. So but the lack of information is one of the main challenges that you find when you are designing and we are implementing and in programming. And that's why we also perform or carry out a new labor inclusion a study in Nicaragua about the people with disability, trying to understand what are the barriers and what are also the protective factors that the youth with disability can utilize for accessing a job.
Great, thank you, Juan Manuel. Milani, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I think one of it is sorry, did I check? Okay, so one of the most challenging is first is it is like what is it like it's like a long problem. I mean, when we talking about the accessibility, of course, we talk about the how also people can trust us on what is the contribution, or what is our opinion to be more, I mean, to be more accepted by them, something like this. So that's the first. So our most challenging is about trust, about how people, how the local governments, how the person with disability itself, because our project is in a sub-district area where lack of the like a technology, and also lack of the proper uh, programs for person with disability, and most of person with disabilities is one of the victims of a pro un what is it unreliable promising. So this is also why I should say this, because this is I think in my own opinion, when we talk about the accessibility, it is also about how do you perform credible in front of the participants, as well as the stakeholders. But situations we have to build this trust from the beginnings, by showing our best efforts. So when we talk about the accessibility in a reality, talking about the infrastructure and others, reasonable accommodations, of course, because of the project is in the sub district, so we found out difficulties to find the venue, like the hotels with accessible hotels. So we have to be more compromised when we found several, like our standard operational procedure, our procedure on accessibles. For instance, there should be a minimum of 5 accessible facilities. When we find that it's only 3 accessible facilities, then we have to compromise about that. Usually, we ask for instance, the hotels, so we ask them to make it a portable, and then it is about the venue, mostly about the venue, and the third is about the area of the sub-district itself. It is about the transportations. For instance, in East Java, this is the project area, the East Java, the sub-district called Trenggalek. It was a lot of hills, and mostly the participant stay in the hills, but there is no accessible roads, and then they have to use, for instance, they have to use motorcycles with the very bad roads, something like that. So we cannot provide cars to pick up them, something like that. So I think this is the most challenges. The fourth is the education background. Thank you so much, Katherine.
Thanks, Milana. Yeah, we all have to work within the environment that we live in and try to make that function. But I also appreciate that you brought this down to the very human level of trust. How do we ensure that people can trust us? And what specific actions are we taking to promote that relationship and that partnership with people? Shauna, I want to give you a chance to step in here if there are reflections that you have as well.
Sure, thank you so much. And just kind of building off of, what our other two presenters shared, in addition to what I heard Juan Manuel say about data and limited information, I think through conversations with our social inclusion experts globally in our programs, what they've noticed is sometimes the biggest challenge is knowing where to start and where to go to for guidance. So we see that disability inclusion isn't happening intentionally and in a consistent way across all of our development programs. And so it's not always through a lack of desire, but a lack of awareness and knowledge about how to make some of the activities more accessible and inclusive, whether that's in the proposal design or activity design phase or an implementation, how to adapt. And so a couple of themes that we saw coming out consistently are how to budget for inclusion, how to create appropriate indicators to measure progress for inclusion or accessibility, and how to also communicate inclusively, share success stories about impact related to disability inclusion. And so for that reason, we worked with our gender equality and social inclusion, Jesse experts, and formed at Chemonics a technical working group focused on disability inclusion to focus on a baseline of those guidance in those three areas for budgeting for inclusion, for monitoring, evaluation, and learning and disability inclusion, and communications toolkit, which has been a good place to start. But in addition to that, as I've heard the other presenters share, engaging with local partners with lived experiences and a diverse range of lived experiences is really key to developing a plan for inclusion, because they are really the experts in their own lives and the ones who can come up with the ideas about what can work, and to reflect the diversity in their own communities. And I would say that that's one of the first challenges and the solutions we've tried to work to identify. But another key challenge that I've noticed, and I'd be interested to hear others have seen this as well, is confronting stigma around disability inclusion and changing perceptions, right? So people with disabilities are actively engaged as leaders in development. And I find that this is a global phenomenon and it's not unique to one country context. And there's still many assumptions about what people with disabilities can and cannot do, or what they prefer to do, right? So a couple of solutions that we've tried to address is one is through recruitment. So one solution that we found to be very effective is that when project teams hire people with disabilities to serve in a variety of roles, not just to serve as an expert on disability inclusion, but for another skill set they offer, such as in operations or grants management or community engagement liaison, that changes perceptions also in that project office, which represents the community, about what's possible. And then another one is through partnerships with disabled persons organizations and disability rights communities to change perceptions, because they can think about how to mainstream inclusion in other project activities, engage with a wider audience through their networks. And this really exposes a larger number of people to persons with disabilities and forming those connections and changing perceptions. It doesn't happen immediately, but it's something that over time is an investment that we see is worth making.
Thank you. I think one of the key things, or one of the key themes that I hear in your comments is a key component of being intentional is doing things with people, not for people. We really need to be doing things in collaboration, in partnership with people. And I love that, at least in American Sign Language, that clasping of hands together to collaborate. But you also referenced in your comments the importance of success stories, which brings us to our second question about, just briefly, if there's a particular thing that you're most proud of in the program, or something that you're really pleased worked out well. What's a brief success that you would like to highlight for people today? I must say, I did hear a lot of themes around relationship building and elevating the community, but I'm really curious. Juan Manuel, would you like to start us off?
Yes, it is really important to build trust, but also to open the doors for the disabled people organizations. Usually disabled people organizations like always meet all together, and they are trying to advocate for the rights and for opening the spaces, but they are not able to really access any other economic or social groups in society. So that's what we learn every time they have a meeting, every time they have a training or a workshop. You always find people that is already in the disability world and understand the needs and understand, but the issue that we understand, personally myself, I understand that the disability work is not with the disability people or with the disabled people, is with all of us, the non-disabled people, is where you need to work. It was quite different because TBSA was supporting the youth to do labor inclusion as well and the workforce development, and we were working with the youth. But when we start like working on labor inclusion, we should start working with the environment, so we can change the environment and the environment can open the doors to the disabled people. So we start with the disabled people organizations, connecting with the private sector, connecting with other networks that or organizations that they don't usually talk to, and that's one of the main achievements that we did. But to do that, when we should work previously with all these new organizations or spaces so they can open the doors. We adapted, because there was leaders from the DPOs that were visually impaired. So the people that were going to receive them, they need to understand how to communicate, how to say hello. Something simply as how to say hello to a visually impaired people. I learned that I have to touch their shoulders and be positioned in a specific way so they can really understand who's saying hello to them. And then when we were talking with the hearing impaired people and with the interpreter, as we are doing right now, we should learn that we should like uh, speak slow, look at the interpreter, but also look at the people that we are talking to, so they feel inclusive. So there's a lot of things that you need to learn when you are non-disabled. But the main thing that we were just communicating to the non-disabled sector is that is something that can happen to them at any moment. So you are now non-disabled, but in a second you can become disabled. So it's not a matter of only rights, but it is a matter of justice, it's a matter of equity, and it's a matter that it's something that can happen to you in any moment, and you will like to be treated as you are now. So I think that that's one of the main things that we were um, doing, opening spaces to the DPO so they can really make a more effective advocate work.
Thanks, Juan Manuel. Yeah, I think we all have an obligation to be carving out those spaces to invite people in to use the convening power that we have, especially for colleagues who are implementing USAID programs. You know, that's a great opportunity. There's a real power that we have to be conveners and to bring together those groups who may not have had that relationship before, so that they can learn from each other, so that we can do the work under the guidance of the disability community. Milani, is there a quick success that you want to share?
Yeah, like Manuel said, that we practice the disability perspective and interactive trainings. So this is like a not I don't I think it's a big door. It is not a small door for person. A person without disability to come into and understand person with disabilities itself. There is no. There's a lot of doubt from the professional who would like to join the project at that time, because mostly of them, they never interact, or they never get along with the person with disabilities. So what we what we offer is the disability perspective and interaction training to them. So this training is like Manuel said, it's easy. It's just like to know how to get well with person with disability, how to say hello, and how to offer something that you would like to engage with them more, something like that. So it's a very easy approaches relating to getting well with person with disabilities. But for us as a person with disability, we sometimes a lot of us like organization of person with disability think that this is like small things. This is not important, that you have to talk about how people with this, how people out there talking to you, how people out there would like to engage with you, such as like telling them on how to say hello, how to get to serve us something like what is it? Help us to cross the road, something, and then anything a very light or very what should I say, that it's everyday activities. So when we train this approach, the interaction training, so a lot of people coming, including one of the university in Surabaya in East Java. uh, it calls the University of Ciputra. Then they are very exciting to know about this training, and for them this is kind of knowledge, very new, barely new knowledge for them, and then they adopt these approaches, this kind of training, where sometimes for a person with disability we think that this is not important. So they adopt it, and then they are to make them more confident to come to join us on the projects, more confident, as well as the partners of USAID as well, and then the coming staffs without person with disabilities, as several staff from the professional. When we train the interaction training, and then they are more convenient, they are more confident on giving some exercise to us, and then trying to find the accessibility. They are more confident on doing everything relating to accessibility and reasonable accommodation. So I think this is one of the make me so proud of it. It's small things that, but it's a big impact to them.
Malani, you're highlighting the fact that these programs have long-term impact beyond the life of the program. And hopefully one of the most important impacts is helping all of the participants be able to continue this work in the future, right? To feel confident, to continue to engage with the community and to be intentional. I just want to take a brief moment here. There's a really interesting chat that was going on that caught my eye. And I apologize, I meant to address this up front when I introduced myself. So I apologize for not doing this earlier. But that's around language and how we refer to disability concepts and people with disabilities. So for USAID, for our official communications, we use persons with disabilities. That's the terminology that's in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And there is a very strong person-first movement within some of the disability community. I will say, because I work with people who also identify with identity first language, when I talk, you will hear me say persons with disabilities, people with disabilities, but also disabled people. And that's in deference to colleagues who prefer identity first language. So if I use one term and not another, it is in no way intended to be disrespectful of people who prefer different terminology. but there's a very diverse community here with different preferences. So we're just trying to be inclusive of colleagues who may have additional preferences on those things. I am mindful of the time, and so I'll start the next question next with you, Shauna, if I may, but I'm mindful of the time, and our next question is also playing on a theme that we're seeing in the chat and in some of the question and answers as well, and that's the impact of the pandemic for the disability community. I know a number of you have talked in your presentations about the relevance of technology, where it's working, where it's not working, how we've maybe had to rely on that even more. And so, Shauna, is there anything you would like to share in terms of the impacts of the pandemic, both in terms of challenges, but also in terms of opportunity here?
Thank you so much, Kathy. Yes, I think that this is a really timely and important question, because as we are seeing kind of the future nearing the end of the pandemic, and we're all hopeful for that, we have to think about the impacts that this has had on everybody, and what those opportunities and what those challenges might be in the next year, the next 5 years. So I think the pandemic has opened up new spaces, such as online platforms, and changed the way we look at accessibility and online platforms. I've seen more virtual events like this one critically think about inclusion that includes a variety of accommodations, such as CART and sign language interpretation, captioning, but also in the language we use, as we've been talking about. What language are we using? Why are we using that language? And how we introduce ourselves. We're thinking more intentionally about inclusion than ever before, and I think that is something that I appreciate so much. I also think that there's been discussions about how remote work can open up more opportunities for persons with disabilities. Before, certain jobs were deemed in-person required, are now opened more remotely. So that can be previously seen as an accommodation. I think that pandemic has shifted a bit that perspective. I also think that the pandemic has also emphasized how people with disabilities lack access to public health information, are at higher risk, and are some of the most impacted during public emergencies. So I think this conversation has been brought to the forefront, and we need to really take that knowledge and put it into action by making our programs more inclusive. I just think about, for example, technology and access to information in our program. For example, in Myanmar, we've been working with the Myanmar Deaf Community Development Association to establish a hotline for victims of gender-based violence who are deaf and hard of hearing. And with a lot of the internet slowdowns and outages, it's preventing them from communicating via sign language through video calls, and many are cut off from reliable means of communication. So I think as much as we've opened up more spaces globally, particularly in urban centers, other spaces have closed a bit, which has a negative impact on the community and the ability to exchange and access information. So it's challenging us to think really critically about technology and access and how we can communicate information. And we've addressed this through other types of apps and other technology that we're still exploring, but it is an important thing to note. And I think particularly when you think about disability and youth inclusion, I think it's even more critical. Young people with disabilities are less likely to get the same type of education or employment opportunities. How has the pandemic furthered this disparity, and how can we address that in the coming years is something that I would challenge us all to be thinking about. And in addition to that, maybe thinking of opportunities such as the internship program that Commonix has partnered with Gallaudet, and thinking about creative ways to engage youth and to advance disability inclusion in your own organizations, to find creative or innovative solutions that we maybe haven't thought about before. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Shauna. Yeah, I think for those of us who have ready access to technology, reliable internet, I've seen that popping up in the Q&A, the concern that people don't have access to basic technology, or if they do, the internet may not be reliable. How are we, as many of us are now pivoting to using these virtual environments to draw people in, that can be a benefit, but also can act to exclude those people who don't currently have access to that technology. Juan Manuel and Melanie, I don't wish to diminish your opportunity to weigh in on this, but I'm mindful of the time, and we've got some great conversation going on in the chat. We've also got some questions that are happening in the Q&A box. So I want to just, as we've got about 10 minutes left here, I just want to pivot if we can. Cole, would you like to hop back on and share some of the great discussions that are happening in the chat there?
Yes, and thank you so much. And I'm just blown away by how in depth and extensive the discussion is. So normally I can piece together some things, but I wanted to go ahead and move across the discussion and some of the questions to answer some of the bigger topical areas or questions that are coming in topical areas across the chat. And the Q&A. So Sean, I talked a little bit about the access to technology and kind of internet, and that is something that has been opening doors, but also difficult for people to access. And I see a lot of people have been putting in how they're partnering and they're trying to work in local communities to kind of include some of this. So building off of that, as we've talked a little bit about it already, there were some questions about social media and advocacy and outreach that had been done during the pandemic to include more people in some of these programs, or reach people that we have not normally been reaching with some of this programming. So I don't know if anyone wanted to kind of talk about that or address that as one of the bigger, I guess, internet accessibility issues that we've been experiencing during the pandemic.
Maybe I can jump because in a few minutes I will have to leave too. But we did our social media campaign from the project, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram pages, but also in alliance with the private TV channel. But one of the main things that we realized is that the peer-to-peer communication was more effective than any other um, uh, communication piece. So what we did is that we have this kind of youth committed and we also have a young and adult working group in the project. So we invited the youth to express what their feelings were, to spread the knowledge that they have of the COVID-19, and to also share the best practices for protective measures, not only for the youth, but also in the family and at home. And we were having youth with hearing disabilities, our youth with visual disabilities, sharing, even though we work in the Caribbean coast in Nicaragua where we have ethnic minorities. So we also produce content coming from youth belonging to ethnic minorities. And I think that this is important because with COVID-19, one of the things that we realize is that the main opportunity, or the greatest opportunity we have in social media, was talking about mental health, which is something that we usually don't talk and we don't pay attention, but we could do that through the life skills training, but also through the social media.
Thank you, Manuel, Juan Manuel. And if you do have to leave early, I just want to say thank you if you have to jump off, for being here today. It's been awesome to have you on board. Another turning a little bit to kind of, some of our implementing partners have been asking some interesting questions around inclusionary budgeting practices and how they work with funding organizations or larger governmental organizations on including some of these disability networks and just practices within their budget. People have been asking for templates, which I don't have, but I think it would be interesting to hear about what are some of the first steps that people as implementers can take to include some of these practices in their programming. I feel like maybe Shauna or Katherine even could.
Sure. I think that I can share from my experience what process we went through. But I think that like really goes back to the point is people want to be creating and designing activities that are more inclusive and accessible, but it's hard to know sometimes where to start. And so as a member for the Excellence in Development and Disability Inclusion group, which is led by MIUSA, Mobility International, we started that conversation to say, well, what's your process? And they provided some guidance based on their organization, their business model, how they go about what percentage of their budget do they look at for allocating reasonable accommodations from the programmatic side, but also from the operations side. And we said, this is great to see their model and their templates, but does that work with our model? How do we make the biggest impact by looking at all the different global programs that we have in the different country contexts, which has different costs associated with accommodations, diverse communities within those country contexts? And how do we then tailor the way that we design each specific activity and make sure that we're integrating reasonable accommodations and other features as well for budgeting for inclusion? And so we went through a series of processes looking at 3 different projects to say, how should we be budgeting for that in those different country contexts? And we created templates and guidance and cost notes. And then we integrated it into how we go ahead and build budgets at the design stage for proposals so that it starts from the beginning. And so that's integrated into, for example, our cost shells when you go through the design process, right? And it has to be ground truth, like any cost assumptions. It has to be saying, okay, what are the costs for vehicles, for interpretation, for printing materials and Braille? But at least it starts to like explain what those assumptions are. What should you be thinking about? Where do they fit into the way that our overall cost looks? And where would those line items come in? And then it really calls them out and it explains what those look like. So it gives you a start. And I would, if I was going about this with a different organization, I would try to go through the similar process where I'd say, okay, let's build a foundation integrated into your systems and then define some of these terms and make it work for the kind of program you had, because a disability-specific disability inclusion program is different than a program with other objectives that you want to mainstream more in. And you have to think about those different needs for that community as well. So maybe that was a long answer, but it's a process. It's not like a quick solution. But I think even being intentional, which is the theme of this conversation about it, you will then, and I think one of the misconceptions is that it's significantly going to change costs. And in most cases, it's not. It is not. And everyone can be doing it on every single program. And once you actually show that in the numbers, it really does change people's minds.
Thank you, Shauna. And then I know I'm also trying to be very cognizant of time. One maybe last theme that has shown up, I think, in the discussion and in the questions is, and maybe Katherine, you can speak to this a little bit, is not only resources for people with disabilities on advocating for themselves to local or national governments, but what kind of policies on the flip side, policies are in place, or if there are no policies in place in a local government, how do you navigate that area, either as an implementer or a person with disabilities, to work with some of the programming that governments provide or that are not provided for the government? I know that was kind of a roundabout way, but we do, there's a lot of resources shared in the chat, I should say, about how to, as a person with disabilities, advocate for yourself to the government. But what are some of the things that the government, on the flip side, is kind of advocating for people with disabilities, and how can we kind of tap into those resources?
I do think, and I'm cognizant of the time, so I'll try to be brief, but I do think the last few years, really since the adoption of the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we've seen a dramatic shift in an elevation of disability rights issues. And whilst there are many countries, ourselves included. Nobody is perfect on this, right? Nobody is perfect. We've all made mistakes. and I hope that one of the things that governments can be doing is sharing those mistakes so that countries who have not built barriers into their environment yet, because maybe they don't have as much hard infrastructure, they can skip ahead to accessible design, right? They can skip ahead to inclusive programming. There need never be sheltered workshops, for example, in employment programming. That just shouldn't be happening. Did we do that in the United States in the past? Yes. Should we have done that? No. Was it a mistake? Yes. Have we learned from that? Hopefully so, but hopefully people can learn from our mistakes. So I think that's a theme that we're trying to, that we're seeing more of governments really trying to look at each other and see, well, what did you do? Oh, maybe that didn't work out so well. Maybe we should just avoid that and try something different. And I think the Disability Treaty has really helped to elevate countries' awareness of these issues, but also elevate the community. The way that treaty was developed and adopted, it could not have been done without the international disability community. And I think that has really set the tone for governments trying to adopt new legislation, new policies. You ought not to be doing this without the community's engagement, meaningful engagement to inform what we're doing, which again brings us back to another piece here. And also, if I may, one of the questions that came up was, what's the relationship between accessibility and inclusion? And I think it's a really interesting question because we sometimes use those terms and we kind of mix them up a little bit, but they're not the same, right? We need accessibility in order to achieve inclusion, but that's not all that we need, right? You could have the most accessible meeting, but if you're not giving due deference to the views and giving space for the disability community, and also making sure people have access to information so they can come to meetings informed, to engage, to be able to provide constructive input, to build the trust that Melanie was talking about, to make sure that there's trust all around. That's more than just access. Access is hugely important and something that we've been grappling with today in our little virtual space. But it's not the only thing, right? That's just a piece of inclusion. The inclusion puzzle, there's a lot more pieces involved in there. And a lot of that is the human building of trust, providing space, and really elevating the voice of people with disabilities to represent issues and provide the guidance that people need to get it right.
Perfect. And that was a wonderful note to actually end on, Catherine. So I wanted to take a moment and say thank you so much to all of our panelists that joined, to our ASL interpreter and our captioner who has been doing a great job. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And a huge thank you to everyone who joined us online for the amazing discussion. A couple of things that I want to follow up on, as in the spirit of information sharing post-event, is you guys shared a ton of resources all about, from the Zero Project to Special Olympics. Site Savers was putting a bunch of great links in there, and UNICEF. And we do have some links that were already included in the event website. We'll collect these links and place them back on to the post-event website with a recording of the webinar today. So please keep an eye out for that. We'll email everyone who registered with that information. It just takes us a couple of days to get everything cleaned up and put on the website. I will go ahead and close out the webinar, but I do encourage you all to visit some of the links. I will leave the chat open for just a few more minutes as we stop recording. If anyone needs one else's information or needs to chat or would like to, I'll leave things open for a couple of more minutes, but I just want to extend a huge thank you once again to everyone involved today. So.
And Cole, would you just like to remind people again of the website, the platform where we're trying to encourage colleagues from the disability community to be engaged so that we can keep these conversations going in the future?
Yes, so we will be posting this webinar specific information on youthpower.org. We also have some communities of practice on youthpower.org that would be of interest, that would probably be of interest to some people here. In order to access the communities of practice, you do have to create a profile on YouthPower. In order to access any of the information that we will be sharing about this event, it will be open access on that platform. So again, that's youthpower.org. So please feel free to check that out. And then one other thing, thank you, Kathy, for reminding me, our youthlead.org, which is our youth-focused platform, is running a social media campaign on equity and inclusion. So each week is a different focus, all the way from disability and inclusion to gender to health. So please go online, visit Youth Lead Global is on Twitter or on Facebook. And the hashtag you can just look up is hashtag #FairEqualJust. So please go online and visit us there, and there will be tons of other information being shared through that social media campaign. So yeah. And like I said, I'll leave things open for just a few minutes, but thank you all for joining if you want to exchange links, but I'll head off a video and thank you, thank you, thank you. You guys have all been wonderful today.
And thank you to YP2LE and Making Sense for putting this all together, for inviting us into this space, and for our terrific speakers, including Nichelle and her wonderful video, and our interpreters and our cart captioner for helping us make this more accessible. So thank you.
Thank you.